Welcome to Inside American Politics. I'm your host, Bradley Teller, and today we're pulling back the curtain on one of the most fascinating political phenomena of our time. Picture this. You walk into what appears to be a vibrant marketplace of ideas, with colorful banners flying and passionate voices calling out their messages. But as you look closer, you realize that despite all the noise and apparent competition, there are really only two vendors selling their wares. Everyone else? They're either working for one of these two giants or struggling to even get a permit to set up shop. This, my friends, is the American political system, a carefully orchestrated duopoly that has maintained its grip on power for over 150 years. And today we're going to explore exactly how this system works, why it persists, and what it means for democracy itself. But here's the kicker. Some experts describe this entire system as brain dead, not because it lacks activity, but because it survives not through natural vitality, but through life support systems of electoral laws, federal subsidies, and strategic barriers. Remove these supports, and the whole thing could potentially collapse overnight. So, is American democracy truly a battle of ideas, or just a stage play with the same two actors swapping costumes every few years? Stay with us. The show's just getting started. Let's start with a fundamental truth that might surprise you. The two-party system, as we know it today, is actually a relatively recent concept. The term itself was only coined in 1911 to describe a political system where two major parties substantially overpower their smaller competitors. Notice I said overpower, not eliminate entirely. Here's what most people get wrong about the two-party system. It doesn't mean only two parties exist. Right now, there are dozens of political parties in America. The Green Party, the Libertarian Party, the Constitution Party, and many others. But here's the catch. The political influence is so overwhelmingly skewed toward Democrats and Republicans that these other parties might as well be whispering in a hurricane. How do they maintain this dominance? Through what I call the political moat strategy. Just like medieval castles built moats to keep invaders at bay, the Democratic and Republican parties have constructed elaborate barriers to keep competitors from reaching their castle walls. These barriers operate at multiple levels. State electoral laws make it incredibly difficult for third parties to even get on the ballot. While Democrats and Republicans automatically qualify in most states, third parties must collect thousands, sometimes tens of thousands, of signatures, pay hefty fees, and navigate complex bureaucratic mazes just for the privilege of being an option for voters. But here's where it gets really interesting. This isn't accidental. Throughout the years, legislative measures at both state and federal levels have been implemented with one clear goal: ensuring this duopoly continues. And here's the fascinating part. Democrats and Republicans may fight tooth and nail over policy, but when it comes to maintaining their shared dominance, they're surprisingly cooperative. Think about it this way. Imagine two rival restaurant chains that spend millions on advertising, compete fiercely for customers, and publicly trash each other's food. But behind the scenes, they work together to make sure no new restaurants can get the permits, licenses, or supply chains they need to compete. That's essentially what we're looking at in American politics. Now let's zoom out and look at this from a global perspective, because that's where things get really uncomfortable for American democracy advocates. In the post-Cold War era, during a conference held in Copenhagen, nations including the United States committed to certain democratic principles. Articles 7.5 and 7.6 of the Copenhagen document specifically state that individuals should be able to seek political office without discrimination and establish their political entities with equal standing. Read that again. Without discrimination and with equal standing. Does this sound like the American system we just described, where third parties face massive barriers while the two major parties enjoy automatic ballot access and federal subsidies? Here's the thing. America often prides itself on being a global beacon of democracy. We've spent decades, trillions of dollars, and countless lives promoting democratic values around the world. Yet our own system fails to meet the basic international standards we helped establish. But wait, you might say, what about other countries? Don't Britain and Canada also have two-party dominated systems? Great question, and this is where the nuances matter. Yes, Britain and Canada do have systems that revolve around two main parties. But, and this is crucial, their electoral and political frameworks tend to allow for much more fluid competition. In Britain, parties like the Liberal Democrats, Scottish National Party, and others have managed to exert significant influence, sometimes even holding the balance of power in coalition governments. In Canada, parties like the New Democratic Party and Bloc Québécois regularly win substantial numbers of seats and influence policy. Regional and minority parties have managed to punch above their weight and create real change. The contrast with the United States is stark. Here, electoral rules and strategic barriers place such a substantial burden on third-party candidates that breaking through is nearly impossible. It's not just difficult, it's systematically designed to be nearly impossible. Now let's travel back in time to understand how we got here, because the roots of our current political divide run much deeper than most people realize. To really understand the fundamental differences between Democrats and Republicans, we need to examine their positions on the greatest moral crisis in American history, slavery. During the mid-1800s, there was a clear and profound distinction between the parties that reveals something essential about their core philosophies. The Republican Party regarded slavery as a moral, social, and political wrong, not just an economic or legal issue, but a fundamental wrong that corrupted the very soul of the nation. The Democratic Party of that era? They didn't classify it in such terms. Now, this doesn't mean all Democrats viewed slavery as morally right. That would be an oversimplification. But here's what's fascinating. The party exhibited a consistent tendency to tolerate or protect the institution through a posture of studied neutrality. The Democratic platform, as articulated by its leading figures, emphasized what they called indifference to whether slavery was voted up or down. This wasn't passive indifference, this was strategic indifference. By refusing to take a moral stance, they effectively protected and enabled the expansion of slavery. Think about this for a moment. When faced with one of the greatest moral questions in human history, whether one human being can own another, one party said, "This is fundamentally wrong," while the other said, "We're neutral on this question." This pattern of behavior, particularly over 5 years leading up to the Civil War, aligned with a broader strategy that promoted the spread of slavery by avoiding any resistance to it. Legislative efforts and judicial decisions, most notably the Dred Scott decision, increasingly conveyed the implication that slavery might, in fact, be superior to freedom. The Republican response was grounded in what they saw as America's founding purpose, promoting liberty. They believed slavery was inherently evil, not only for the enslaved, but also for the free citizen, the soil, and the moral fabric of the nation. Their goal wasn't immediate or violent abolition, but rather placing slavery on a path to eventual extinction through constitutional means. This wasn't just political positioning. This was a fundamental philosophical divide about human nature, moral responsibility, and the purpose of government itself. Fast forward to the modern era, and we see echoes of these fundamental differences in how the parties approach politics today. In their groundbreaking 2016 book, Asymmetric Politics, authors Matt Grossman and David A. Hopkins reveal something fascinating about the current nature of our two-party system. The Republican Party, they argue, is more ideologically driven, while Democrats focus more on forming coalitions and addressing specific societal issues. This isn't just academic theory. This has real-world implications for how politics actually works in America. Democrats generally align with mainstream academic research and discussions in mainstream media, but here's the key point. They don't necessarily adhere to a single overarching ideology or worldview. Instead, they're more like a coalition of interest groups working together on specific issues. Environmental groups, labor unions, civil rights organizations, urban communities, each with their own priorities that sometimes align and sometimes conflict. Republicans, on the other hand, show less interest in developing specific policies for particular groups facing societal issues. But they are much more ideologically homogeneous, with shared non-negotiable values that include traditional Christian morality, faith in unregulated capitalist markets, and a belief in the importance of American military power and willingness to engage in foreign conflicts. This difference explains so much about how our politics actually function. When Democrats lose an election, they often engage in deep soul-searching about their message, their coalition, their strategies. When Republicans lose, they tend to double down on their core ideological principles. But here's where it gets really interesting. This ideological coherence has led Republicans to create their own parallel information ecosystem. Republicans have increasingly perceived mainstream media as biased, leading them to rely on openly conservative outlets. Over the last 2 to 3 decades, conservative talk radio programs, Fox News Channel, and right-wing internet outlets have had tremendous influence on Republican voters. But here's what's fascinating about this. Republicans haven't just consumed different media, they've built entirely separate research institutions. More so than Democrats, Republicans have established their own research bases outside of conventional academic institutions, in the form of think tanks. They expect their selected experts to be regarded with the same respect as those working in mainstream academic institutions, regardless of whether this is objectively justified. The result? Many loyal Republican voters exist in what researchers call a media bubble, largely disconnected from mainstream scientific, humanistic knowledge and political opinion. When they do encounter mainstream views, those views are often filtered through their preferred sources and can become skewed or distorted. This has profound implications for how Republicans approach scientific consensus. Take climate change, for example. The Republican Party has exhibited skepticism toward scientific consensus on human-caused global warming. But Grossman and Hopkins argue that this doesn't stem from inherent hostility toward science. Instead, Republicans tend to reject scientific findings when they conflict with their ideological preferences. Their opposition to government interference in the market leads them to reject evidence supporting solutions to global warming that would involve such intervention. It's not that they hate science, it's that they filter scientific information through their ideological framework. Now here's where our story takes an interesting turn, because the red state, blue state narrative that dominates our political discourse. It's largely a myth. Recent studies of voter attitudes and state institution governance suggest that American states are neither distinctly red Republican nor blue Democratic, but rather increasingly purple, signifying a blend of political ideologies. Think about what this means. Despite all the heated rhetoric about deeply divided America, the reality on the ground is much more nuanced. The studies show that while rural areas are typically more conservative than urban ones, this gap has been gradually lessening. Political discrepancies between upstate and downstate regions in states like Illinois and Indiana are shrinking. Here's a perfect example. Both Democratic and Republican representatives concurrently served Virginia's coal mining regions in the Virginia General Assembly. The same communities, dealing with the same economic challenges, elected representatives from both parties. But perhaps nowhere is this purple reality more evident than on the issue of climate change. Despite the widely discussed partisan separation regarding climate change, the divide is not as vast as often portrayed. A compilation of national polls from 2002 to 2011 consistently showed higher levels of concern for climate change among Democrats than Republicans. But here's the crucial point. These polls also demonstrated that the majority of Americans, regardless of party, acknowledge climate change as a real issue, express genuine worry about it, and desire action from government and industries to address the problem. A survey conducted before the 2015 UN climate talks in Paris showed 85% of Democrats, 64% of Republicans, and 71% of all Americans agreeing on the importance of reaching a consensus on climate action. The views of Republican voters are far from homogeneous. By a 2-to-1 margin, they believe the U.S. should reduce its dependency on fossil fuels and invest in renewable energy. Polls between 2012 and 2014 indicated that 62% of moderate Republicans and 73% of liberal Republicans favored strict carbon dioxide emission limits from power plants. Here's the kicker. These poll results help explain why a significant majority of Republican voters feel their Republican representatives do not accurately reflect their views on climate change. Studies of U.S. Senate voting patterns confirmed that many Republican senators do not vote in line with their constituents' concerns about climate change. This brings us to one of the most troubling aspects of modern American politics: the strategic use of scapegoating to distract from substantive policy discussions. Let's be clear about what we're seeing. During his candidacy and presidency, Donald Trump frequently criticized immigrants from Mexico, making inflammatory claims about their character and intent. He asserted that Mexico was dispatching individuals with significant issues to the U.S., such as criminals and drug dealers, specifically labeling them as rapists. These claims have been thoroughly debunked by immigration researchers and law enforcement data. Similarly, Black Americans often find themselves unjustly characterized as problematic by critics opposing efforts like affirmative action. These critics argue that programs addressing systemic racism unfairly disadvantage white individuals. When figures like Senator Roger Wicker insinuated that Justice Ketanji Brown Jackson's Supreme Court nomination was merely a result of affirmative action rather than her extensive qualifications, they were promoting what researchers recognize as factually incorrect narratives. In the realm of LGBTQ issues, Florida Governor Ron DeSantis advocated for legislation dubbed the Don't Say Gay law, prohibiting discussions of sex and sexuality in educational settings while dismissing them as woke gender ideology. This perspective has been extensively criticized for marginalizing and disregarding the realities faced by transgender and LGBTQ youth. The Muslim community has also been targeted. During his presidency, Trump attempted to restrict Muslim immigration through measures like the travel ban and made statements insinuating that Islam harbors inherent animosity toward America. Representatives like Marjorie Taylor Greene and Lauren Boebert have used inflammatory language against Muslim colleagues, despite these narratives being widely discredited as factually incorrect. Even the education sector hasn't been spared. Criticism has been directed at the portrayal of critical race theory in schools, despite it being absent from K-12 curricula. Some Republican circles have depicted honest discussions about slavery, segregation, and systemic racism as a form of indoctrination, a position met with staunch opposition from educators and historians for its misrepresentation of educational content. But here's what's really happening beneath all this rhetoric. While Republicans often target marginalized groups, critics argue that this serves to distract from who's actually responsible for the genuine societal and economic challenges many Americans face. The argument goes like this: Republicans prioritize the interests of the wealthy and powerful, consistently resisting policies like universal health care, minimum wage increases, environmental initiatives, and fair taxation. Why? To satisfy the needs of their affluent donors and corporate allies. Think about it this way: if you're struggling economically, it's much easier to blame immigrants, minorities, or cultural changes than to examine complex systems of wealth concentration, corporate influence, and policy decisions that favor the already wealthy. This isn't just political theory. We can see it in voting patterns. When substantive economic policies that would help working-class Americans are proposed, they often face strong Republican opposition, particularly from leadership, even when polling shows Republican voters themselves support these policies. Some Republican figures and media outlets have even embraced elements of what researchers call the Great Replacement theory, arguing that white Americans face levels of discrimination equal to that of Black Americans. Nearly 40% of Republican men in a Pew survey expressed that advancements in women's rights negatively impact men, beliefs that conflict with broader public consensus and historical evidence. Critics suggest that Democrats need to more explicitly identify and hold accountable those responsible for genuine societal and economic challenges. By addressing corporate influence, wealth disparities, and prioritizing equitable policies, the goal would be to refocus political discourse on substantive solutions rather than divisive rhetoric that obscures the real sources of economic inequality. So where does this leave us? We've explored how the American political duopoly maintains its grip through systematic barriers, how historical moral divides continue to shape party philosophies, how media bubbles create separate realities, and how scapegoating distracts from substantive policy discussions. The picture that emerges is complex and deeply revealing. We're not just watching a democracy unfold. We're watching a performance staged by two dominant players, each benefiting from the illusion of competition. But here's the truth. Once you understand the system, you can start to question it. And once you question it, change becomes possible. Want to hear the full episode and uncover even more about how this political machine works and how it might be reimagined? Head over to the Skoob app now and listen to the American political theater in full. Download the app today on the App Store or Play Store and start seeing politics through a sharper, clearer lens. Thanks for tuning in to Inside American Politics. I'm your host, Bradley Teller. Until next time, stay curious, stay skeptical, and never forget, democracy belongs to those who refuse to sleep through it.